Why did the ancients go to such trouble to build the megalithic sites, do you think?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. They clearly were motivated by sacred or religious impulses. They wouldn't have just done it for pragmatic reasons, because there don't seem to be any. I know that there are people who think that they might resonate or emanate or whatever, but you wouldn't build so many megalithic remains all over the world just in order to resonate and to emanate.
I think that's a very good point. It is without doubt true to say that there are a great many similarities globally in many of these sites, whether it's in terms of construction method, location aligning to geomagnetic faults, geomagnetic energy, alignment to stellar objects, sun, moon, stars. What for you is the most compelling explanation of the similarity?
Well, there's no doubt whatsoever that many of these structures, if not most of them, are astronomically aligned, and the large rings are certainly connected to the solstices or equinoxes or both. They have connections with the lunar motions. The people who were the megalith builders were very astronomically alert, and this was the big thing for them. It's hard for us in our modern urban world of today even to be aware of the fact that you can see the night sky. I mean, you can't see the night sky in many places today. Just go out anywhere and there's all this light pollution. But imagine a time when all they had were lamps and you could see the stars really bright. It's an amazing experience. And they were attempting to be in harmony with the cosmos and to honor the cosmos. This was their tradition, their culture. There's no doubt about that.
So, do you think, given the choices that are given to us, essentially, which is that these cultures independently developed similar styles of architecture and alignment, or that they descended, for want of a better word, from a common parent culture? Which would you plumb for?
Well, I think that they're mostly connected because we have to realize that the megalith builders were a maritime culture and they were getting around in their boats. Interesting point about the maritime aspect of the megalith culture is how did they navigate so well? What I'm getting at is they must have been able to tack into the wind. They must have had something like fore and aft rigging. They can't have just had square sails. Otherwise, they could not have accomplished these maritime feats. Now, this interests me in particular because I wrote a book called The Genius of China, which is about Chinese inventions and discoveries over a period of 3,500 years. And amongst those was the invention of fore and aft rigging and the ability to sail into the wind. But it's become pretty obvious to me that the megalith builders must have been able to do this. But where's the evidence of this? And one of the things that really bothers me the most is, what can we find out about their ships and their sailing techniques? And did they have rudders, or did they still rely on those pathetic steering oars that most people had in the really old days? So where was it all really coming from? Did they have centerboards? How are they doing this? What was the nature of their sailing craft? I really would like to know so much more about that.
And given that we're having trouble even now accurately dating stone monuments, stone megalith, stone sites, how much harder to go searching for contemporaneous, what must have been wooden vessels, which have long since rotted away, except in very exceptional circumstances, of course. So it's a challenge.
It's a big challenge. We have a lot of rock art of early ships in the eastern desert of Egypt. the pre-dynastic Egyptians were seriously into boats, and not just sacred boats, not just boats of the sun. We haven't quite figured all that out yet. But those boats are just not interesting enough. There's got to be some evidence somewhere. But these megalith people don't seem to have been into doing pictures of their own seacraft, you see. Most frustrating. That's the thing that I really worry about.
Unless, of course, I mean, obviously I've seen, as you may well have yourself, Michael Tellinger's presentation earlier, where he's talking about some very, very ancient dates for some of his discoveries in southern Africa. If that can be corroborated, and if we are genuinely looking at not tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of years before Common Era for some of these megalithic sites, then it becomes perhaps less surprising that there's little left in terms of evidencing these cultures other than the stone monoliths themselves.
Well, as all the discoveries coming out of Africa in recent decades show, there's a lot involved in where you look. And look what they've been discovering in the Amazon, of all places. I mean, we were told, conventional wisdom told us, that the Amazon is just a big, boring rainforest full of all kinds of interesting creatures, but no archaeological interest. What could happen there with all those big trees and all those snakes and everything? But now we discover, because of all the terrible deforestation that's taking place and all this really, really tragic overlogging, and I just hate to think of it. The deforestation really upsets me very much.
Mm-hmm.
But they're clearing all this land and discovering traces of human settlements that were there before the Amazon rainforest existed. I mean, who would ever have imagined that could come out? And so it's in where you look. If you look in unlikely places, you find unlikely things. The problem with archaeology is that it's so narrowly confined. Each individual gets into a very narrow little rut. And as they get older, they get narrower and narrower. They don't broaden out. They don't lighten up either. They get more and more pressed as funding for scholarship declines, as university posts decline, as salaries don't go up, in fact go down, as the pressures get more intense, people become more and more paranoid about, how am I going to cling on to some academic post and be able to feed my children, assuming they have any children? I think academics do have them sometimes. And therefore, the only thing to do is to play ultra safe. So how do you play safe? You keep your head down, you never say anything about your very narrow specialty, and you make your specialty even more narrow. So first of all, nobody else can talk about it because it's so narrow that you're the only one who knows. And secondly, it's so narrow that you're not threatening anyone else, so you're not going to make any enemies, they're not going to stick too many knives in your back, and you might somehow survive. And this is what's happening. Plus, the decline in imagination, the dumbing down of cheap media coverage, the lowering of the tone generally, the terminal decline of our civilization, the subsidence of our culture into inanity and stupidity, the fact that people only have 30 seconds of attention span anymore because they're too busy, aren't they, with their Blackberries and their iPods and all these gizmos and devices, and they're on their phones, you know. And I got to look at my message. You know, somebody wants to speak to me, and if they don't want to speak to me, I'm really worried because I don't exist, because I don't have any friends anymore, because it's been at least 5 minutes since somebody sent me a text. I mean, the neurosis, the addiction to the instant gratification of constant communication, the lack of any ability to reflect, and the collapse of the educational system so that nobody under 30 can spell or count or even speak, frankly, anymore. That businessmen cannot find secretaries who can type a letter because they misspell everything. And this is not dyslexia. This is lack of education. They have not been taught. You get people graduating from the university who can barely spell their names. Is this not a collapse of the educational system? And the people who are in denial about it, what kind of people are those? These are either perversely blind people or they have some vested interest, like politicians.
Well,
Our very least favorite people, politicians, even worse than bankers. Remember that.
perhaps these are the same people who have a similar mindset and wanted to keep their jobs by not rocking the boat.
Everybody's scared.
And not pointing out that the emperor has no clothes.
Very few people want to tear up the carpet and pull down the curtains, kick holes in the walls like I do. I am a very dangerous character because I like to tease people, especially people with no sense of humor. That's one of my hobbies. But also, I like to challenge all conventional assumptions, not just because I'm mischievous, but because I don't believe any of them. I don't actually believe anything. Everything is only conditionally accepted. I am the most extreme skeptic you will ever meet because I literally don't believe anything is true. That's because I don't believe that absolute truth can be reached by creatures as lowly as ourselves.
I'm very encouraged to hear you say that, and I inculcate this into my own children. Although I have a great deal of my own beliefs, I'm quite explicit in telling them, now don't believe me, go and find out for yourself. And I think that's an important distinction. Instead of trying to ram facts into kids' heads, encourage them to be skeptical, encourage them to be inquiring, and that's, I suspect, what we're missing.
And never believe what they're told.
Exactly so. Yeah, rock the boat. If we can come back just for a second to what you were saying about academe and how it is in fact structured in such a way that it is, by definition, unscientific. It is now working against incorporating new information, new findings, and then altering its paradigm. How do we change this? What's the solution? What needs to change?
Human nature, perhaps? It's systematized ignorance. It's institutionalized stupidity. And it's taking conventional knowledge, or at least they call it knowledge, and rigidifying it to such an extent that if you dare to question it, it's the chop. It'll be the gas chambers next. We're all Jews if we rock the boat, and we've all had it, because we are the Untermenschen, because we dare to challenge them being the vain elites, self-appointed, of course, never chosen or elected by us.
Do you think then that there is something that they, other than power itself, that they are jealously guarding and trying to work towards a situation where nobody else can find truth, whatever that might be?
Yes, and all the factors combined is that terrible thing called human vanity, the even more terrible thing called egotism, not to mention the odd touch of megalomania here and there. We can all think of lots of them. But then there's the lust for power, the obsessive desire for control of everything and everyone. And it's just getting worse every day, isn't it?
So is there a solution perhaps in looking to the past to a solution, rather than ever dwindling more explicit technology, as you say, iPhones, internet, television, mass communication of the banal every moment of the day? Is there room perhaps to look to the past and seek quietude?
Yes, well, I'm always with one of my many noses in the past. I've got lots of noses. And
I beg your pardon, continue.
I think we can draw a lot of inspiration from certain aspects of the past. I think that the Egyptian traditions are a tremendous lesson for us. Their concept of Ma'at, which is cosmic order, and how they structured an entire society upon this, would repay a lot of intense study. And I do a lot of intense study of it, but everybody should do that. I think that we can draw a lot of interesting lessons from the true original traditions of many of the world's religions before they became poisoned and distorted and ruined minutes later by crap followers of the people who originated these ideas. And you only have to look at the original version of Christianity. There's no doubt that Jesus really existed, although he didn't come from Nazareth, because Nazareth didn't exist in his day. He was Jesus the Nazarene. Nazarene is a sect of what the rabbinical Jews would call heretical Judaism. I would call it authentic Judaism. And it comes from the word Nazar, which means truth in Aramaic. And Jesus believed in Nazar. He was a Nazarene. people ought to give a bit of time to thinking, what is a Nazarene and what was he really getting at? Because you won't get a lot of that from the standard sources. You have to read things like the Gospel of Thomas, for instance, which I couldn't recommend highly enough.
Edited, of course, from the Authorized King James Version.
No, the Gospel of Thomas is a Gnostic treatise that was found at Nag Hammadi. It doesn't have any stories in it. It's just the Master said, the Master said, the Master said. It's sayings. A lot of the Gnostic writings, well, they're uneven, but a lot of them are absolutely fascinating. But you have to be able to interpret them in context. And you do need to know quite a lot. You need to read like hell and don't stop, you know. Never let a day go by without passionately trying to learn. If you don't have the motivation, if you don't have anything like that to drive you, you're never going to get anywhere. You can't study these things in a desultory, occasional manner. You have to be seriously motivated. You have to be determined. It's a struggle. You have to go out and find the things. Then you have to not only read them, but you have to reread them. And you have to compare them with other things, and you have to get the knowledge of the context. You have to learn about the different periods of history. You have to learn about all the different cultures. You should never stop. You know, life should be one long learning curve, really. You stop learning, you're dead.
Quite so. I'm glad you brought up Egypt, because I wanted to touch on that. You are, if I remember correctly, a member of the Egypt Exploration Society.
Yes, I think I've been a member since 1972.
Now, Egypt is an area I've studied to the best of my ability for a very long time. I would say that there seems to be emerging evidence that, if nothing else, our chronology, or let's say the orthodox chronology for a great deal of ancient Egypt and pre-dynastic, prehistoric Egypt, is now coming into question.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. My new book, Egyptian Dawn, deals with this chronological chaos, as I call it, because everything prior to 2000 BC is uncertain. One of my points that I belabor is the fact that one of the main sources for Old Kingdom and archaic history in Egypt is faked. Now, you've probably heard, if you're into all this, of the Palermo stone, which is certainly genuine, and that in 1910, additional fragments of this broken stone were discovered in the Cairo Bazaar and sold by antiquities dealers. Well, I'm convinced that they're all forged. This is very serious because all the chronological writings of Egyptologists since 1910 have been poisoned at the well with this completely false information. And the first thing we have to do is clear all of that out. We have to take a brush and cleanser and scrub absolutely clean all of our historical reference works from this misinformation, from these forged antiquities known as the Cairo stone fragments. They just are complete fakes, and that alone has completely spoiled everything prior to 2000 BC for our understanding. It's got to get rid of that rubbish. That anybody who's in England, all they have to do is go along to the Petrie Museum, which I highly recommend in general, fascinating place, and look at what's known as the Petrie Fragment, which is one of these Cairo fragments. It's the only one that Petrie himself bought from an antiquities dealer. Now, look at it really closely. If you go into that museum, they'll hand you a torch or flashlight, and you can shine it on it and look at it really close. And look at the lines that divide the compartments on the stone fragment. It's only about this big, you know, it's not very large. And you will see that they do not reach the edge of the fragment, most of them.
Interesting.
They stop short. And you know what that means? It means that it was a fake because they didn't dare, from that fragment of basalt, carve the lines to the edge in case it flaked, and that gave the whole game away. The lines stopped short. If it were genuine, they would have gone all the way to the edge, and then it would have been broken, you see, and you would not find those lines stopping short. And there are other reasons why these fragments are fake, because a very remarkable chap who's no longer alive, called Dr. Patrick O'Mara in California, who was rather obsessed by this subject and published a lot about it. He had all kinds of theories which may or may not be valid, but the thing that interests me is that he discovered that the Palermo stone was drafted in such a way in its design of its compartments and whatever that it was done with a cubit rule, which is what all the scribes used, which is according to the standard canonical measurements. Mm-hmm. The Cairo fragments are not. Whoever faked them did not know about cubit rules, did not have one, and they do not follow the cubit divisions of fingers and palms and so on. And so that in itself proves they're fakes. But what's wrong with all the Egyptologists that they could not figure this out for themselves? Just what is wrong with all the Egyptologists? I might put it as a more general question like that. What is wrong with them? That they have allowed themselves to be duped.
Is there a, perhaps room to, we were talking previously about how academia itself doesn't want to rock the boat for its own self-preservation. Is there not room to consider that's part of the problem?
Academia never wants to challenge anything. They just want an easy life. We forget that academics are not only human, they're subhuman. And so you've got a problem. They're not interested in the truth, they're interested in their jobs, they're interested in their promotions, they're interested in putting knives in each other's backs. It is the most vicious world. It's worse than politics. These people, what they do to each other, the way they behave, the viciousness, the ruthlessness, the unscrupulous behavior, the dishonesty, the lies, the falsification of data. It's unbelievable what they get up to, academics. Really, they are the lowest form of life. They are true vermin.
Let me ask you about Colonel Richard Howe Vyse. What do you make of him?
I think that he was a shifty character, and I've done a very extended analysis of Vyse's diaries in Egyptian Dawn, in which I have found that he contradicts himself, and I have found internal evidence within his diaries to prove that the graffiti in the chambers above the king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid were faked by Vyse.
I'm delighted to hear you say that, because that's always been my suspicion too. At one point, for my own small part in this, I tried to lead a group to get permission to test the quarry marks, because of course, being composed of red ochre, they had an organic component, and to have them carbon-14 dated. But of course, the last thing you want is actually proof that it's a forgery. So that was...
Well, in my opinion, they couldn't be more obvious forgeries, but you don't even need to look at the physical evidence. All you have to do is read his diary, where he contradicts himself. And, well, you can read all about it in Egyptian Dawn, because it's several pages of analysis of the written evidence, the documentary evidence, to prove that he was up there with paint pots of the same color paint, and he was writing things all over those walls, and then he says that when he breaks open chamber after chamber that there's nothing there, and then later he says that they were covered in these graffiti. Well, so which is true? Mm-hmm. Were they there or were they not there? They can't. Both statements can't be true. I mean, it's obvious when you do a systematic analysis of what he himself said in his own words, that they had to be forged.
And when you then look, of course, at the context of what he was up to at the time, he was hanging on the coattails of Cavaglia, or in the shadow of, should we say, Cavaglia, had nearly run out of funds, was about to be sent home, and miraculously suddenly discovered these. And of course, on the back of that, he's hailed as a hero of the Victorian age, and becomes a member of Queen Victoria's household as a result. So,
Howard Vyse was not a hero. Anybody who blasts away half the southern face of the Great Pyramid is no hero. He was just too ready.
Vandal.
He was a vandal, you know. He was using dynamite on everything that moved or didn't move. And he was an adventurer. He was a desperate man, because somebody put 10,000 pounds up for him to do all this work, and he didn't find anything. He kept finding all these chambers, and there was nothing there. And Well, I described this in Egyptian Dawn, what a desperate man he was, and the fix he was in, and what the pressures were that he was under, and what his motivations were.
So given that, let's be generous and say that the quarry marks are questionable. Let's just leave that there for a second. Without the quarry marks, there is no other single piece of graffiti to attribute the pyramid anywhere in it or on it. And given that there's never been a body found in it or on it, and given that its dating is pretty much exclusively contextual, based on contextual remains, does that not then throw open the door wide for a much more remote date for its construction?
Well, you probably don't realize that I've done dating work in Egypt,
Okay.
with permission of the grandly styled Supreme Council of Antiquities. And I've done it with a collaborator, Professor Ioannis Laritsis of the University of the Aegean, who is a former nuclear physicist, now professor of archaeometry, who has invented a new dating process called optical thermoluminescence, which you can use to date stone structures directly. And in Egyptian Dawn, I reveal the dating results at Giza, and that we have proved that the pyramids could not possibly have been constructed by Cheops, Khephren, and Mycerinus, because we've dated the pyramid of Mycerinus, and in the span of dates that are possible, the latest possible date was before Cheops was born, so consequently the story cannot possibly be true that the 4th dynasty kings built those pyramids. Unless you change the entire chronology, go back and adopt Breisted's chronology, for instance, and make everything several hundred years earlier, then of course you can have your things work out, perhaps, maybe. But on the current chronologies, the pyramids were not built by the 4th dynasty pharaohs.
That much you're certain?
Absolutely, we've got the results.
So, does that then make the king list something that's worth looking at a second time then?
Well, the king lists are now a really big problem because everything's earlier than it's supposed to be, but we haven't got enough kings to fill all that time span. So where are the kings? I mean, the uncertainties are just endless. Look at the 3rd dynasty. Nobody knows how many kings there were in the 3rd dynasty. Some people say, oh, there were only 3. Some people say, oh, there were 9 or 11. There's only one book on the 3rd dynasty by Swalim, Nabil Swalim, I think is his name, the Egyptian chap who publishes books in Alexandria. He wrote a very interesting book on the 3rd dynasty, and he's got lots of kings. But look at the kings. We started out with one King Teti, that's in the late Old Kingdom period. And then we found another King Teti, an earlier one. And then we found another one, so we've got 3 kings called Teti, and that's a bit of an embarrassment of riches there. We don't really want 3 Tetis, and we don't know where the 2 earlier Tetis are. We only know where the last one was in the chronology, in the sequence of kings. And we've got all these kings that we don't know, did they really exist? For instance, there's this king called Menes, and I'm certain that Menes was not a real name. I discuss that in Egyptian Dawn, and I say what Menes really means, because of course it's a Greek form of something that's Egyptian. And I think James Allen had the answer there. I explain all of that in Egyptian Dawn. And in a sense, we've got too many kings for certain things, and then we've got insufficient kings for other things. And our ignorance really is just extraordinary. It's just, and yet we know a great deal more about the 1st dynasty kings than probably the people living in the 3rd dynasty knew, because I don't think that proper annals existed in the 1st dynasty and 2nd dynasty, the archaic period. It was really at the beginning of the 3rd dynasty, I think it was Imhotep under King Zoser, who started trying to create some annals, because what he obviously did was he gathered up from all over Egypt and from robbed graves and so on, all the old stone bowls he could find, especially ones that were inscribed with names of early kings. And he had, I think it was 40,000 of these miraculous stone bowls.
These are the diorite ones, and the ones made of, that's the other material, I forget the name of.
Well, they're made of all kinds of stones, yeah. And with the exception of the alabaster ones, which anybody could make, it's very difficult to understand how they were made, because these stones are so hard. Like diorite is very hard. Mm-hmm. But he gathered up about 40,000 of these bowls, and he stored them underneath the step pyramid, which he designed and built. And they were an archive that he wished to preserve for eternity. And I think it was part of his attempt to create annals, because by gathering the inscribed bowls, he was able to discover the names of kings. And then he had to try to figure out in what order they occur. Now, there's one bowl that was found beneath the step pyramid that's got 3 kings in sequence, for instance. Well, that's very invaluable information for somebody like Imhotep, because he then knows that those 3 kings succeeded one another. And he takes whatever evidence he can scrape together in order to try to piece together a real history. Now, to return to the Palermo stone, there are 7 kings' names there, which are pre-dynastic, which are kings of what's called Lower Egypt, which of course means the north, because in Egypt everything's turned upside down, so lower is above and upper is below in terms of our thinking. And nobody's ever bothered to translate these names. So I have translated those names. I don't know why no one bothered to do it before, but the translations of those names is very revealing. You get names like King Smasher and King Macehead and King Fighting Fish of the Delta. These are great warrior names, you see. It's a bit like the King Scorpion that we already know about, who came from Upper Egypt. And why is it that no Egyptologist has ever bothered to work this out before?
Let's talk for a moment about the pragmatic aspects of megaliths. We've seen, let's stick with Egypt, fantastically gigantic stones are involved, and we're not talking about soft stone, we're talking about limestone, we're talking about being brought from astonishing distances, dressed and then hauled into place. How do you imagine they were able to do these feats that are a challenge even today?
Well, I believe in the cast stone theories of Professor Joseph Davidovits, whom I know very well. We have worked together. We are involved in business together. I've known him for 11 years. And I've seen cast blocks weighing 3 tons and 4 tons that he has cast using his recreation of the limestone concrete recipe that I believe that the Egyptians used to build the pyramids. Those blocks of the main pyramids at Giza are not cut, they're not carved, they're not transported, and they're not lifted by the non-existent cranes. They are cast, they are concrete.
They're cast in place then?
In place, in situ. And the reason why you can't fit a razor blade between most of them is because they're cast directly on top of one another. They let one dry out, and they cast a new one on top. It takes about maybe 3 days for one of those blocks to dry properly.
Wow.
I know a great deal about it because I've been involved with Joseph for years, and I'm absolutely convinced that he's correct in his idea that the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, the Pyramid of Khephren, the Pyramid of Mycerinus are made of cast limestone. Well, of course, there's a great deal of granite in Mycerinus, so we'll leave that for a separate discussion. But the limestone was cast, and it's therefore not necessary to have cranes, because all you have to do is you carry rubble and water up into these locations. You have boards that you cast the things in, and then you take those away and you use them for the next block, and so on and so on.
So how about the correlation? Because conventional wisdom would have us believe that the stones were hauled from Aswan.
Oh, that's granite.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Okay, yes, quite so.
I'm talking about limestone.
Yeah.
Limestone is meant to come from here, it's meant to come from there. But I believe a lot of the limestone came from the Giza Plateau, and that the reason why they had those depressions and had pools of water was they had to disaggregate the limestone in order to make it into the rubble that they would then transport up in sacks or whatever to the places where they were dumping it into these wooden frames, mixing it up with water, pounding it with hammers, because it polymerizes. They had a very simple but ingenious chemical process to polymerize these blocks and to turn them into concrete.
Let's talk for a second about the actual, the mathematics, if you like, the geometry, the astronomy of the siting and the building of the Great Pyramids. Let's talk about the Great Pyramid in particular. Aligned to within 3 seconds of arc to the cardinal points, incorporating phi and pi, placed centrally to the greatest portion of land mass. Are these feats that are echoes of a technologically advanced civilization?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. I've spent a lot of time analyzing all of that, and Egyptian Dawn is full of new facts there. And a later book will have even more in it. In between Egyptian Dawn and that later book is this other one, which has all the information in it about Abydos and the Assyrian and so on, because we've done work there. We've dated the Assyrian and made a lot of discoveries in the Temple of Seti I. I've also applied my textual analysis techniques to the excavation reports of Henri Frankfurt, the most famous of the excavators, and meant to be the definitive excavator of the Osirian. And I discovered many contradictions and errors in his reports. Once again, I own my own copy of this. You really have to have your own copies of these books. You just can't do this work in libraries, because when I'm doing all this, I have to spread 40, 50, 60 books out at once and cross-consult all of these things. And you can only do that if you own your own copies. That's why you simply have to invest thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds in buying these books. Otherwise, you can't get the answers.
Indeed. But just to talk about Frankfurt for a second, are you saying that his annotation was wrong, or the conclusions is wrong, or he's just making mistakes in his calculations?
Well, his methodology wasn't always correct. He also contradicted himself. He ignored certain evidence. I found places where he would report the discovery of something, and then later he would say he hadn't discovered the thing, and he was careless, and there are lots of flaws in his books, which are not immediately apparent. They weren't apparent at all to me at the first reading. You see, you have to read these excavation reports several times. Now, I've done a lot of work on the Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple at Giza. The only excavation report that exists of the Valley Temple is in German by Uwe Hulscher, published in 1912. So I had to translate the whole bloody thing. That was very difficult, because Hulscher's very archaic German. It's incredibly difficult. And he made up words as he went along, as Germans love to do. And it was really difficult. And with the Sphinx Temple, which was discovered in 1936 by Salim Hassan, he excavated it, but he didn't write a proper report of his excavations. He spent a lot of time talking about the Sphinx, but then he discovered the Sphinx Temple, but he never really published an excavation report of the Sphinx Temple that's up to very much. It's very sketchy, and so then it was re-excavated in about 1972 by Ricke, a German guy. And that excavation report is also disappointingly brief, but I had to translate that because you can't even begin to consider these structures until you get the text, the basic texts, and master them, and learn through constant readings and rereading and cross-correlating all the different passages exactly what is in there. Then you start discovering the anomalies. and you begin to find the flaws, if there are flaws. I found some flaws in Ricky, but he was a pretty good archaeologist, but he did miss some very embarrassing things.
Just to close up, because I'm very conscious of not wanting to take too much of your time. In a nutshell, do you believe the ancients were intentionally leaving messages for us today?
It would be easy for us to assume that, overvaluing ourselves as we do. I'm inclined to think that they weren't necessarily leaving messages for us. It may have been in the back of their minds, but I think that they were basically leaving messages for the gods. They were honoring the cosmos by discovering and recording its secrets and encoding them and concealing them with multiple levels of secrecy as an act of piety, I suppose. Who knows if they thought that somebody might discover this one day, but certainly discoveries I've made about the Giza design plan, which are absolutely astonishing to me, and I'm the one who discovered them. I don't know what people will think who see them and read about them. They are so complex and ingenious. I compare the people who did that with chess grandmasters. There's layer upon layer. There's a design plan, and on top of that there's another design plan, and on top of that there's another design plan. And if there are certain key things that you don't know, you can never decode these plans. And even if you decode part of it, it's designed in such a way that the next level is impenetrable to you. That one might lead to another, but you would never discover the way to do that. So I've managed to discover 3 complete simultaneous Giza design plans, which are overlaid in successive layers. And there's a lot more that I didn't bother to describe, because you can go on, and where do you stop? But they are quite fantastic. There's 12 million square feet in the Giza plan. And in that area, I've got everything precise to within 2 feet of all these fantastic geometrical things. It's utterly fantastic. But you have to remember that it's not just that it's fantastic as a design. What's more fantastic is that it was implemented and done on a slope. Because if you look at it in a flat plan, as if looking down from above, that's one thing. But it was implemented on a slope, because it's a sloping plateau. And yet it's implemented to this incredible degree of precision, of accurate to within at least 2 feet, if not 1 foot. I'm using English feet, not cubits. Out of 12 million square feet of area. And they were doing this in giant stone structures on a slope where you couldn't get a proper surveying sighting line. And if you want to survey the base of the Great Pyramid, for instance, they left a big piece of rock sticking up. You couldn't sight from one corner of the pyramid to another when it was so-called leveled, because it wasn't leveled. You couldn't stretch the cord. How can you stretch a cord when there's a lump in the middle? What's going on here? How did they do this? This is why you have to go back to my earlier book, The Crystal Sun, which I published in 2000, where I showed that they actually had lenses which they were able to use in rudimentary theodolites to achieve the sighting accuracy necessary to gain the precision of orientation for these amazing structures. But even then, how do you get around the fact that you can't achieve sighting lines because you've got bumps and lumps in the way, and it's all on a slope? We're talking about serious engineering dilemmas here. And I've made a lot of discoveries, but I feel that I'm only at the beginning. That we need to really all pool our collective thoughts on this. This is a big problem. We've all got together and tried to work out what was really going on at Giza.
Professor Robert Temple, thank you very much indeed.
Megalithomania.